smashed into East Pakistan. Hundreds of thousands of people died, attracting sympathy from all over the world. But the Pakistan government's own relief effort was seen in the province as too little, too late. The president himself only visited East Pakistan after a fortnight.
People realized that if we remain within the framework of Pakistan, during the time of crisis, a Pakistani ruler will not come and stand by our side.
This wasn't the best time for Pakistan's military government to be seen to be neglecting its eastern province. The country was about to hold its first fully democratic national elections. The main political leader in the east, Sheikh Mujib, was demanding regional self-rule for East Pakistan. A Mujib victory could change the shape of the country forever. Pakistan had been created in 1947 as an independent nation for India's Muslims. Millions migrated there. But as the Muslims were historically concentrated 1,000 miles apart in the northwest of India and in East Bengal, the country which emerged consisted of two separate wings. West Pakistan and East Pakistan shared a government and a religion, but not much else.
Well, language was one of the main differences. But then there was the differences in food habits, clothing, and the way of life in general. It is true that some of the provinces in what was West Pakistan were more homogeneous. They had fewer non-Muslims. But in Bengal, we had lived with the Hindus, a larger number of Hindus for a long time, and there were common exchanges. So this was also seen as one of the differences. I mean, the Muslims of West Pakistan would look down upon the Muslims of the East as not being true Muslims.
From the appointment of Jinnah as Governor-General in 1947, Pakistan's power base lay in the more developed West. However, more than half the country's population lived.
And they thought that unless we can establish our Bengali identity and we can have more powers for the province, this independence becomes meaningless for us.
The Bengalis' desire for self-rule increased 6 years later when the army took control of Pakistan. The military was dominated by West Pakistanis, who in 1965 embarked on a costly war with India over the disputed territory of Kashmir. Although the fighting took place in the west rather than the east, the whole of Pakistan was expected to foot the bill. East Pakistan itself was provided with little defence against India, which surrounded it on three sides. Instead, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Bhutto reassured the East Pakistanis that China would have protected them.
The 1965 war with India was something of a watershed. The people argued that if the defense of East Pakistan then did not even lie in West Pakistan, but lay in China, what was the point of surrendering all these resources for strengthening the Pakistan army and thereby securing your defense? I think after this, the general sense of disillusion with one of the central assumptions of the Pakistan state was in fact universal.
East Pakistan now had a charismatic leader to voice its grievances. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, a former student activist, had risen to become the leading politician of the province. His Awami League party had a huge following, united by a demand for Bengali self-determination.
Do you think that Bengal can ever be economically self-sufficient?
Not only self-sufficient, Bengal can give helps to others. Don't you know the history of Bengal? In the day when the British government occupied Bengal in 1757, one businessman of Bengal could have purchased the London city.
Mujib devised a program for the East and West wings to become self-governing units in a federation of Pakistan. This became the Awami League's manifesto. Crucially, each unit was to have control over its own economy, including how much money it gave towards the federal defence budget.
Obviously, the problem was that The West would have said that we want this level of defense expenditure to meet this threat. And East Pakistani would have said that no, we don't think there is any threat. We are not subject to that threat, so we are not going to really contribute that much. So it had really become an impossible situation.
Just how impossible became clear when civil unrest erupted in Dhaka following Mujib's imprisonment on a conspiracy charge. His supporters saw this as an attempt to send Mujib to the gallows. East Pakistan students fought especially hard for Mujib's release. When the case collapsed and Mujib was freed, the students laid on a triumphant reception in front of a 1 million strong crowd.
And there, as the president of that meeting, and on behalf of the people of East Pakistan, I asked the people who were present, the man who wanted to give his life for the emancipation of the people of this part of Pakistan, I like to give him a title. The entire population, masses present in that meeting raised their more than 2 million hands and gave me the permission. And I declared that our great leader Sheikh Mujib will be the Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujib. That means friend of Bengal. Bangabandhu means friend of Bengal.
But while Mujib's popularity soared, Pakistan's President Ayub Khan was forced to step down in the face of increasing opposition to his regime. Ayub's successor, General Yahya Khan, finally agreed to call national elections for December 1970.
I think Yahya Khan's motives were that, well, we could give elections. No party would emerge with an absolute majority in the national parliament, and he himself, with the backing of the army, would then be the arbiters of the new democratic dispensation which would emerge out of the elections. This assumption was based on the false belief that there was enough opposition to the Awami League in the then East Pakistan to deny them an overwhelming majority, though I think they all conceded that he would win about 60% to 2/3 of the vote.
Yahya Khan had gravely underestimated the Awami League, which won a landslide victory in the east. This gave Mujib's party the overall majority in Pakistan's National Assembly, which would draw up a new constitution for the whole country. Mujib's victory was Yahya Khan's nightmare, and it would lead to the greatest crisis in South Asia since partition. Urgent political meetings were held in Dhaka during the first few weeks of 1971. Mujib was visited by both Yahya Khan and Bhutto, the former foreign minister whose Pakistan People's Party had won the most seats in West Pakistan. But Awami Leaguers would still outnumber Bhutto's party in the National Assembly by almost 2-1.
The bottom line in the case of Bhutto remains that he didn't want to remain outside power. Now what system he wanted, it was not clear. What sort of constitution would take care of his concerns that he should be in power in any case, it's not clear. He never made it clear. So the cover he gave for this was the interest of West Pakistan. In fact, they did coincide. The army felt threatened. They felt threatened that they wouldn't get all the budget that they have been getting if Mujib became the Prime Minister.
Bhutto announced that his party would boycott the National Assembly unless Mujib moderated his demand for regional autonomy to be included in the new constitution.
The demand on one side was let the assembly meet, let the political process commence. And the other side was saying, no, we won't allow it to commence because they felt that they could not control that process. And they wanted to use force. By not allowing the process to start, they said, until there is some agreement on basics, we will not allow this assembly to be held. In other words, that they were holding a gun to your head saying that we will not allow you to meet unless first you sort of agree to certain of our basic terms for the constitution.
But Mujib was holding fast as well to a program for regional self-rule which his opponents argued would break up Pakistan.
Now the public position taken by Mujib left very little to be negotiated about. It wouldn't have hurt East Pakistan or the position taken by Awami League if they had been a little more flexible. But Mujib took the stand that his own extremist element won't let him concede anything. But that's neither here nor there. The political leader is supposed to lead.
But while the standoff in Dhaka continued, arms and soldiers from West Pakistan began quietly arriving by air and sea.
On February 28, a shipload of arms were brought to Chittagong port in a vessel known as MV Swat. Now the troop build-up and the bringing of a shipload of arms and ammunition, that made us absolutely suspicious that the troops are coming and arms and ammunition are coming for them. And remember that there was no Indian military build-up. So we started asking ourselves, if there are no military build-up across the border, for whom these troops are coming?
On March the 1st, 1971, Dhaka exploded in outrage when Yahya Khan postponed the National Assembly indefinitely, just 2 days before it was due to sit. Mujib retaliated by declaring a mass non-cooperation movement.
We don't believe in armed struggle. We have fought and suffered because we followed the constitutional procedure and constitutional convention. And we believe in democracy. But the people who are always trying to kill democracy in this country, they're more powerful now.
Mujib's most radical supporters had begun to organize themselves along military lines. Although still negotiating for a federal settlement, Mujib was now doing little to dissuade his militants who wanted East Pakistan to become a wholly independent nation. Bangladesh, the land of the Bengali speakers. The tense situation was attracting international attention. Dhaka's biggest hotel was filling with journalists, including one young reporter who was to land the scoop of a lifetime.
The campaign of civil disobedience was clearly getting out of hand, and the Daily Telegraph asked me to go to Dhaka to report on the negotiations between Awami League and the government. All of us, the press corps at the time, there was about 40 journalists here, we all had a sense that anything could tip the balance. It was a very delicate situation, and the talks between the West and the East were very much in the balance.
The negotiations just seemed to be sort of, being prolonged. And we would come back and say that, the fear, our fears, we shared our fears with Sheikh Mujib and the party's executive committee, saying that, look, we as negotiators feel that they are deliberately dragging things out. And the fear is that, the fear that they are just taking time while the military build-up is being carried out may well be what is going on. So let us not be unduly hopeful of the outcome.
The point of no return was about to be reached. In Chittagong port, Pakistan naval forces opened fire on dock workers attempting to block the unloading of the ship MV Swat. Dozens of workers were killed. On the afternoon of March the 25th, with the army firmly in place in Dhaka, Yahya Khan flew back to West Pakistan.
The moment that we had heard Yahya Khan had gone and flown home, we knew that was it, that the carpet was about to be pulled. And I think everyone knew that. It was like everyone ran for cover.
Many people came to him that they suggested my father to leave the house and go for hiding. But my father was not prepared because he said that if they come to arrest me and if they don't get me, then in the name of searching me, they may kill many people in this country.
At 10 o'clock, or just before 10 o'clock, I heard that the first convoys had left the barracks. And I understood from a couple of sources that there were about 3 battalions on the move, an armoured battalion with tanks, an artillery battalion and an infantry battalion. That's a lot of soldiers and a lot of iron to put in on a city where, according to Pakistani propaganda, was armed to the teeth, but from our knowledge had nothing more than a few old muskets and a couple of grenades.
Well, the army was trying to restore the rule of law. The army's main objective was to restore the authority of the central government, which had been completely destroyed by the civil disobedience movement. Now, as far as the use of force is concerned, it was very controlled, absolutely controlled, there is no doubt about it.
The army operation carried on throughout the night. There were no independent witnesses as the press corps were confined to their hotel. The army was to escort them out of the country the next day, whether they liked it or not.
I didn't see how I could walk away from this story without getting out there and seeing what had happened. And I think this has made I felt it even more because I had in the 4 or 5 weeks I'd been in the country, made a lot of friends, Bengali friends. And I thought, that's it, I'm not going to go. But you have to work out a system for doing this. I chose the roof because then I could hide underneath the central air conditioning unit and occasionally come out onto the top here and look over the edge to see whether or not the army had come and taken away the other journalists. Every time the army came, the Bengali staff in the hotel had to find a different place to hide me. Hot and sweaty, this one, but it was usually the kitchen. And down a long corridor, there used to be a cupboard where they kept kitchen utensils, pots and pans, and they'd shove me in here for a couple of hours.
Having evaded the army, Simon Dring and a French photographer who'd also stayed behind made a secret tour of the city.
We knew what we were going to see was going to be unpleasant. It had to be, given the extent of the firing and the way in which it had gone on for so long, but you're never quite prepared for it. When we arrived at the university, there was a place called Iqbal Hall, which was one of the main dormitories for the students. And this is where most of the real pro-Awami Leaguers hung out, the hardcore, if you like. And there were shell marks all over the building, and there was a smell of burning. And I remember walking down this long corridor that went past all the dormitory rooms. And I looked in one room, and it looked as though it had been ransacked, and there was a student sprawled dead across an easel. And another dormitory, there were 2 students dead in their beds. When you looked down from the balcony out across a lake, near the lake was a big pit where we were told they had buried some bodies. We counted in all nearly 30 bodies in and around Iqbal Hall and across the campus. There'd been pretty heavy fighting there, and a lot of people had died.
The army had targeted 2 student halls which they regarded as training areas for militants.
They were organizing, they were spearheading the movement, and they were creating a lot of trouble. There's no doubt about it, but I don't know how many students might have been killed on that night. I had been to those 2 places on the morning and afternoon of the 26th. I did not see any dead bodies there. The debris may have been removed since. So I'm not trying to tell you that there were no casualties at all.
We drove down some of the back streets, and we came to an area that I had known quite well before the crackdown, as a busy, noisy, colourful place full of stalls, and it was completely leveled. It was this great sort of acreage of just smoking ruins of twisted, corrugated iron. And people who were still in that area said that the troops had come along during the day on the 26th. And they had positioned jeeps at the end of each street with men with machine guns on them. And then soldiers had run down the little alleyways between the shops and the stalls, tipping gasoline over the walls and just throwing matches and setting them alight. And then anyone who wasn't burnt to death was shot as they ran out into the alleyways.
Simon Dring smuggled his story out of Dhaka and became the first journalist to give an eyewitness account of the aftermath of the crackdown. By then, Dhaka was firmly under military control. Mujib had been arrested and taken to Pakistan. The Bengalis now knew that their self-determination could only be won by force of arms. Civil war in East Pakistan had begun. The East Pakistan Rifles were under West Pakistani command, but with mostly Bengali troops and some Bengali officers. Captain Rafiqul Islam, concerned by the military build-up at Chittagong, had made plans to rebel. As soon as news reached him of the attack in Dhaka, he and a group of Bengali troops made a preemptive strike on their West Pakistani comrades at their Halishahor headquarters.
We took over the whole of Halishahor by about 11. In a very short time, because we were fully prepared. And we arrested about 400 non-Bengalis in 2 hours' time without firing a single bullet.
The rebels then set off to launch their first direct action against the Pakistan army.
We ambushed this column, and the Pakistanis lost about 70 of their officers and men, including the commanding officer of the Frontier Force Regiment and his second in command and few other officers and JCOs.
In April 1971, a Bangladesh government in exile was formed in India by Awami League leaders who had escaped Dhaka. Said Nasrul Islam became vice president. Mujib, imprisoned in Pakistan, was made president in his absence. Other pockets of armed resistance had opened up in East Pakistan as Bengali troops and police rebelled, taking their weapons with them. But by June, most of the rebels had been forced to retreat across the Indian border.
Pakistan's strength at that time was being raised gradually to about 5 divisions. And if you want to attack a conventional force of 4 to 5 divisions, you need at least double. Normal standard is 3 times. But even if you don't have at least double, you don't have a chance to win. We realized that to raise that much of a force with a government which do not have enough resources and fund, it will be very difficult. The cheapest is to go for a guerrilla warfare. Side by side, prepare your conventional forces.
The guerrillas' tactics were to weaken the Pakistan army through sabotage, ambushes, and by disrupting communications. Trained at camps in India, the guerrillas, called Mukti Bahini or freedom fighters, fought side by side with regular troops.
নিয়মিত বাহিনী আর মুক্তি বাহিনীর মধ্যে পার্থক্য একটাই যে নিয়মিত বাহিনী অর্থ উপার্জনের জন্য যুদ্ধ করেছে, বেতন পেয়ে তারা যুদ্ধ করেছে, আর মুক্তি বাহিনী তার মাতৃভূমির স্বাধীনতার জন্য যুদ্ধ করেছে। এবং যেহেতু দেশের মুক্তির জন্য তারা যুদ্ধ করেছে, সেই হেতু একটি নিয়মিত বাহিনীর চাইতে মুক্তি বাহিনী অনেক বেশি শক্তিশালী এবং দক্ষ হতে পেরেছে।
The guerrillas ranged from university students to illiterate villagers. The most decorated woman fighter of the conflict was Taramon Bibi. As a 14-year-old village girl, she was adopted by a sergeant in a guerrilla camp. Taramon started out cooking and cleaning and ended up fighting.
তখন ওই পশ্চিমের নদীর ঘাটে ওই রাইফেল নিতেও, তারপর স্টিং গান নিত, ওই পাখি মারার ইয়েতে মানে ওই ট্রেনিং দেওয়া হইতো। ওইটা মানে আমি ট্রেনিং দিতাম পাখি মারায়। মানে ওইভাবে ট্রেনিং দেওয়াতে মানে 1 মাস চলে যায়। আমি ট্রেনিং দেওয়া শিখলাম বা আমি পাখিও মারলাম। এইভাবে আমরা রাইফেল করেছি। হ্যাঁ, এইভাবে এটার মধ্যে মানে গুলি ঢুকতো। হ্যাঁ, ঢুকলে মানে এই টিভি দিলে একটা মুক্তিযোদ্ধারা গাছের আলো তাকাই দেখতো যে কোনো জায়গায় পাক সেনাদার আমাকে হামলা করে কিনা। ওই গাছের আলো তাকিয়ে দেখতেছে যে পাক সেনাদাররা গান বড়াই না, ওই তারা আবার ঘাটে চাপাইতেছে। তখন ওই দৌড়ে আসে আমার বাবার কাছে বলতেছে যে স্যার সর্বনাশ হয়ে গেল, কিন্তু পাক সেনাদার এসে গান বড় চাপিয়েছে। তখন আমরা খাওয়া বাদ দিয়ে হাতের বাদ জাকি দিয়ে দিয়ে সম্পূর্ণ মুক্তিযোদ্ধারা আমরা সব রাজপুর চলে গেলাম। রাজপুর যাইয়া হেরে কিন্তু আমরা 1 আসার পর্যন্ত আমরা হাতের অর্থ চালান শুরু করলাম। কিন্তু অর্থ চালাতে চালাতে কিন্তু আমরা আসার উত্তর পর আমরা বাস পাইলাম যে পাক সেনাদার কোনো শব্দ নাই।
While this wasn't yet a large-scale civil war, its fallout was catastrophic. By June, nearly 4 million refugees had crossed into India, creating an enormous economic burden. India was already secretly giving the Bangladeshis military support against its old enemy Pakistan. The question now was whether the refugee problem gave India an excuse to intervene openly.
Now, as far as Pakistan, I don't think we could have been more foolish, because we had been all the time depending on this very illusory hope that India will not intervene in a big way.
You have to give them some support, because otherwise these refugees will come and stay in India, and that will become extremely impossible for India to provide them. Economically, it was just not feasible.
It would be quite reasonable to conclude that it was not because of any humanitarian reasons, or it was not because of any altruistic factors that India. It was because India wanted Pakistan to break up. There is absolutely no doubt about it. Absolutely no doubt about it.
By early November, the Bangladeshi guerrillas held strips of territory on the borders of East Pakistan. India now began to take direct action.
India started giving us heavier weapons. And I also observed that Indian military had started reconnaissance along the borders. And they were making very big movements, although very secretly. But as military people, we could make out that it's a very big move. And then I became hopeful that India is going to get involved with us in a big way.
We realized that this may eventually end in a war. So we had to make preparations. And if it did end into a war, we just didn't want to sit back and do nothing about it. For the sake of our own security, we had marshaled our resources in the east. We had our forces deployed that if there is a war, we must finish it as quickly as possible.
On December the 3rd, 1971, India and Pakistan commenced all-out war. Pakistan struck at air bases on India's border with West Pakistan, arguing that India had already invaded its sovereign territory in the east. India responded with air attacks of its own and within 3 days had grounded Pakistan's Eastern Air Force. Combined Indian and Bangladeshi forces under Indian command advanced on Dhaka and Chittagong. Dhaka was now under constant unhindered air attacks from the Indians. On December the 15th, Indian troops entered the suburbs.
I came down with the Indian armoured units from the north, and I rode into Dhaka on an Indian tank. I remember all those images from World War II, of the liberators arriving in Paris and everyone rushing out and cheering. And it was a wonderful feeling driving into the streets, and of course Dhaka was wild.
On the 16th of December, which was the darkest day in the history of Pakistan, we honestly didn't know what was happening. We didn't even know whether it was going to be a ceasefire or a surrender.
On the afternoon of December the 16th, 1971, the Pakistan Army in the east under General Niazi formally surrendered to the Indian commander, General Arora. 2 weeks of open war between India and Pakistan had brought 9 months of civil war to an end. Bangladesh was now an independent country.
তখন আমরা যাই না ফেলাম যে না জয় বাংলা স্বাধীন আসলে বাংলাদেশ আমরা স্বাধীন করতাম তখন আমরা ব্যক্তি সবটি মুক্তিযোদ্ধার আমরা কিন্তু মানে পতাকা উড়াইতাম আমরা বলতাম যে জয় বাংলা আমরা দেশ স্বাধীন করছি তখন আমাদের মানে ফুর্তি আসতো আনন্দ লাগতো যে আসলে আমরা দেশ স্বাধীন করছি আসলে আমরা দেশের বাসিন্দার আমরা দেশে বসবাস করতে পারবো দেশে শান্তি মতো থাকতে পারবো মানে শান্তি আলে শান্তি মতো খাইতে পারবো এটার জন্য আমরা দেশ স্বাধীন করতাম
Bangladesh paid a high price for its independence. The country's most famous monument is a memorial to those who died. There are no reliable figures for casualties, but one particular event on the very eve of surrender seemed to sum up the horrors endured by the ordinary civilians. The massacre at Raya Bazaar, a deliberate attempt to wipe out the country's intellectuals.
We lived practically from day to day. We never knew whether we will live another day because there was so much killing going on around us. My sister Selina was also here. She was editing her own journal, which was titled Shilalipi. Shilalipi was publishing a lot of articles on Bengali nationalism. Another thing that we did not know at the time is that Selina was secretly helping the freedom fighters. She used to provide medical aid, foods, and perhaps some shelter also.
In the final few days before the surrender, dozens of civilians in Dhaka were rounded up and murdered by pro-Pakistani loyalists and paramilitaries. Among the missing was Selina Parveen.
I was informed by my cousin, Mujir, who used to live with her, that she was taken away. He went out to look for her, and ultimately he located her body on the evening of 17th. I went out to find my sister's body, but when I reached Ajimpur graveyard, my brother has already laid her to rest. So I really could not see my sister's last remains. When I asked my elder brother why he did that, he said that it was in such a condition no man could stand it.
Hundreds of bodies were recovered from where they were dumped at Raya Bazaar, a brickmaking ground. The dead included teachers, journalists, and doctors. Raya Bazaar now lies under water for most of the year, but the mark left on a war-torn and vulnerable new country by the loss of some of its finest mines would not wash away so easily. In January 1972, Sheikh Mujib returned from nearly 10 months' imprisonment in Pakistan to an independent Bangladesh and a hero's welcome.
It was really one of the highest moments, the highest moment in one's life. But I found Sheikh Mujib remarkably pensive. And he said, you know, we have won our independence. It is this unity that gave us independence. And this is the real achievement, that you could unite all of our people. But you know what I'm afraid of is that, you know, our independence can only be held if we remain united. But you know how the tendency among us to get at each other's throats. And if we cannot sort of sustain this unity, we will have difficulties in retaining our independence.
Mujib took the office of Prime Minister rather than the more ceremonial one of President and set about establishing the government's authority. A key task was to recover the thousands of weapons acquired during the war, which were now in private hands. Freedom fighters were encouraged to surrender their arms in showpiece ceremonies.
ঠিক মুক্তিযুদ্ধের পরে আমরা যে অস্ত্র হাতে লড়াই করেছি সেই অস্ত্র তার হাতেই সমর্পণ করা অথবা জমা দেওয়া উচিত এবং এই উচিত কাজটি সকলে যাতে অনুভব করে তার জন্য আমি প্রথমে অস্ত্র জমা দিয়েছিলাম যেহেতু বাংলাদেশের মুক্তিযুদ্ধে আমার কাছেই সবচেয়ে বেশি অস্ত্র এসেছিল
With the speedy passing of Bangladesh's new constitution, it looked as if Mujib's fears about political division might be misplaced. But within months, open opposition to the Awami League had emerged. At the forefront was the National Socialist Party, known as the JSD, which demanded a revolutionary government.
এবং রাষ্ট্রক্ষমতার অংশীদারিত্ব, জ্ঞান, বিজ্ঞান, প্রযুক্তি, মেধা, প্রজ্ঞা যারা একটা রাষ্ট্র পরিচালনার জন্য অবদান রাখে তাদের যদি অংশীদারিত্ব না থাকে তাহলে মুক্তিযুদ্ধ করে আবার ব্রিটিশ বা পাকিস্তানি পদ্ধতির সরকার বা রাষ্ট্র প্রতিষ্ঠার মধ্যে কোনো পার্থক্য নেই। এই কারণে স্বাধীনতার পরে যখন আওয়ামী লীগের সরকার গঠিত হলো, যারা মুক্তিযুদ্ধ করেছে তারা সুখী হয়নি, তারা আনন্দিত হয়নি। তারা মুজিবের কাছে আশা করছিল যে সবাইকে নিয়ে একটি বিপ্লবী সরকার হবে।
Mujib's government couldn't afford to make enemies. The attempt to clear up weapons from the war had failed as thousands remained unaccounted for. Civil unrest could now become armed unrest. For a while, Mujib's fortunes on the world stage looked brighter. He re-established relations with Pakistan, now led by his old rival Bhutto. Mujib was welcomed by the Soviet Union and courted by other revolutionary figures. He hoped these visits would build up the market for Bangladesh's main export, jute. But his decision to sell it to Cuba had devastating consequences. In 1974, America announced it was withholding food aid shipments in protest. Record floods hit the country while the aid dispute remained unresolved, reducing food stocks to critical levels. The government had no money to buy grain on the open market. Food prices trebled to a level well beyond the means of the poorest households. The resulting famine cost tens of thousands of lives. For Mujib, it was a personal and political disaster.
I think there was a kind of trauma which he suffered when there was a famine in 1974. And he kept saying, in my government there should be a famine. When I am the head of the government, that there should be people who should die of hunger. I mean, what really has gone wrong? And so that was something that I think affected him very profoundly. And that in a way made him receptive to all sorts of suggestions of how to change course.
By now, anger towards the Awami League government had led to a law and order crisis.
The demonstrators were in the National Mosque, waiting for a suitable moment to break the law, a ritual gesture. For a time, the police tried to use persuasion. They told the demonstrators, "You're turning the House of God into a political centre." Then patience ran out. The police went in, using the same sort of harsh methods their Pakistani predecessors employed before independence. 2 MPs were among those arrested. That the administration is afraid to allow protest rallies is a sign of how its popularity has been eroded.
Mujib shared with close colleagues an increasing concern that Bangladesh's military might intervene directly to restore order. He saw it as crucial that he re-established his authority and took radical measures to do so. In 1975, the man who'd always fought for democracy turned Bangladesh into a one-party state, with himself as president. Democracy in Bangladesh had lasted barely 3 years.
I said, look, this is something I don't understand because, throughout your life, throughout our entire movement, we have stood for a different system of governance. You have espoused it all your life, and I see in this danger to the country and danger to you personally, because you will become a target in the new system, and I don't want to be party to it. So I took leave and came away. And it's still a mystery to me as to who were able to prevail on him.
Other political parties were banned outright or incorporated into the state party, which MPs were required to join on pain of losing their seats. Nobody could contest elections unless nominated by the party.
He did it for the national unity. It is not a question of one-party system. He wanted to run that country at that time, taking everybody with him. And he virtually made a national platform. And he mentioned in his different deliberations that this is a system which will not remain permanently. This is a test. I like to see that our people get their economic emancipation.
Mujib never lived to see whether his desperate measure had worked. On August the 15th, 1975, a group of army officers burst into his house. When he challenged them, Mujib was shot dead. Further shooting followed, in which Mujib's wife and sons were also killed. The only 2 survivors of the family were his daughters, Rahana and Hasina.
Well, my father was the president. They killed him for grabbing power, but I don't know why they killed my mother, why they killed my brothers. My younger brother was only 10 years old. They killed him. It was very difficult for us to believe that this kind of thing may happen. For many months we couldn't believe. Still, when we think, it's really very difficult for us to accept this.
After 2 further coups that year, the Army Chief of Staff, General Zia Rahman, took charge of the government and later became president. Having allowed Mujib's killers to go free, he himself was assassinated. Parliamentary government would not return to Bangladesh until 1991. 25 years of troubled independence have not brought a significant rise in the living standards of the majority of Bangladeshis. Their country remains one of the poorest and most populous in the world.
বঙ্গবন্ধুর পাশে ইশারায় আমরা আজকে ঝাঁপিয়ে পড়ছিলাম বলে আমরা বাংলাদেশ স্বাধীন করতে পারছি। ঠিকই আমরা বাংলাদেশ স্বাধীন করছি, ঠিকই আমরা মুক্তিযোদ্ধার। আমাকে নাম উল্লেখ নাই, আমাকে কোনো মূল্যায়ন নাই। আমরা আজকে ভাঙ্গা ঘরে বসত করি, আমরা রোদে পুরি, বৃষ্টি আমরা ভিজি। আমাকে কোনো মূল্যায়ন নাই, আমরা ঘরে কোনো ভাত নাই আজকে পেটে, আমাকে মাজায় বস্ত্র নাই। আমরা টিপি রোগে ভুগছি, কেউ পঙ্গু হয়ে আছি, কেউ ভিক্ষা করতে আসি, কেউ বাড়ি বাড়ি কাজ করতে আইছে, কেউ রাস্তায় পড়ে আছে। আমরা এই অবস্থায় আছি।
In June, the Awami League, led by Mujib's daughter Sheikh Hasina, returned to power for the first time in 21 years. The party